Can killing be justified ever in the name of justice? Can violence becomes moral if it serves a higher purpose? Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, once very close friends and leading figures of French existentialism, had this major political and ideological fallout somewhere around 1950s, centered around this precise question. And even today, this question is very much relevant in Kaziranga. The essence of this forest of northeastern India is to be within spitting distance of what looks like hippos outfitted in medieval armor and the vision of danger sharpened by the rifle-toting guard behind you. To that extent, I was incredibly blessed by meeting 33 one-horned rhinoceros, including the very rare sight of rhino mating, countless elephants, eastern swamp deer, exotic species like hulak gibbons, capped langurs, greater hog badger, monitor lizard, and diverse avian life, all within 3 safaris. Frankly, had I not experienced here how a tigress could imitate sambar deer's alarm call yesterday, if only a tiger's roar hadn't penetrated all my senses just few hours ago, and had I not heard so much about that tigress that killed a rhino from the time I stepped inside this evolutionary theater, I would have been utterly content, even without any tiger sighting. The dense tall elephant grass and marshy riverine terrain here provide way better natural camouflage for the tigers, in contrast to central Indian jungles with more open forest cover and less denser undergrowth. Also, by this time I accumulated enough experience to know the forest works in mysterious ways. While watching the signs and reading the press pieces require patience, perseverance, and knowledge, one cannot rule out the role of fortuity. But this was my last safari in Kaziranga on this trip, and after 3 epic outings inside and around this national park, oh God, I'm in love and I want more. In post-war Paris, Camus and Sartre appeared to stand shoulder to shoulder, and to many important observers, they seemed like 2 voices of a single existential conscience. Till they were not. Once killing is accepted as necessary for history to progress, Camus argued, a rebellion becomes tyranny. For him, no idea, not revolution, not justice, not history itself could outweigh the absolute value of a human life. Killing might occur in tragic self-defense, but it could never be morally justified by a higher purpose without destroying the very meaning of justice. This was my line of argument when I questioned capital punishment at the very end of my video around Arjikar College incident with a medical student. Sartre, on the other hand, had come to believe that neutrality in the face of oppression itself is a moral failure. Writing from a Europe divided by colonial wars and class struggle, Sartre saw revolutionary violence as historically unavoidable. To refuse to take sides was, in effect, to side with the oppressor. While he did not celebrate killing, he argued that moral purity was a luxury unavailable to those living under systematic violence. History, as Sartre understood it, forced terrible choices, and refusing those choices did not absolve one of responsibility. It merely disguised it. And I cannot say I stand against his viewpoint either. In fact, in today's world, it seems far less delusional. But it was not a neutral opposition on ideological views. Sartre accused Camus on moralism, political naivety, and an abstract humanism devoid of real suffering. Even though the interesting aspect about this is that Camus actually came from a background of suffering, while Sartre had a much more privileged upbringing. Camus argued that once killing is justified by history, there is absolutely no stopping point, no line that cannot be crossed. Sartre countered that refusing revolutionary violence allows violence to continue under the guise of order and legality. Camus responded personally, wounded not just intellectually but emotionally. Sartre's reply was cold and dismissive, effectively ending their friendship. The close bond between two of the greatest philosophical and intellectual minds fell apart over this one ethical conundrum. One saw greater danger in moral compromise, another saw greater danger in moral withdrawal. And the same ethical dilemma I explained in the second episode of Kaziranga Chronicle, and in the next episode, that is in episode 5, I'm going to explore why Kaziranga has been stupendously successful in rhino conservation by following actually Sartre's ideology, along with my thrilling safari experience. But is taking life to safeguard rhino is justified? I think the result speaks for itself, right? Because in 2025, no rhino has been poached in Kaziranga, which is a great conservation success story. Africa is still struggling. And even in terms of tiger conservation in India, according to the NTCA data, 166 tigers died last year, not for poaching, but due to results of infighting. And I think 12 deaths happened in Assam for tiger, and out of which 7 happened in Kaziranga. And none of them were poached. They are results of infighting, which also exposes a larger conservation issue of space constraint, basically deforestation. And wait, before you form an opinion and write in comment section, hear this out. On a late December afternoon in Assam's Majoli district, where I visited, smoke curled over a river sandbank and where a new forest was taking root. This was not just any patch of grain, it was Molai Kothani 2.0, a forest created with sweat, hope, aspirations across generations of dedications by India's one of the most beloved environmental figures, Padma Shri awardee Jadav Molai Payeng and his daughter Munmuni Payeng. In the span of hours, much of this carefully cultivated ecosystem, thousands of trees, bird nests, and habitats created over years were reduced to ashes. They were charred. The blaze was not a wildfire driven by drought or accident. Reports indicate this as arson, a deliberate attack by unidentified miscreants. If killing is justified to protect wildlife, then a certain section of people will also kill animals to protect their interest. So where does this end? Where shall we draw the line? Assam's forest, the protection of the 100 rhinoceros has long been presented as a moral victory for conservation. The state's shoot at sight policy against poachers is often celebrated as a hard but necessary choice that helped revive a species once at the brink of extinction. Yet this narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable when extended further, when killing people in the name of conservation becomes totally unquestionable. This is the dilemma actually, because supporters of Assam's tough conservation model argue that extraordinary threats require extraordinary responses. Rhino horn trafficking is driven by international crime syndicate. They are ruthless, armed, and forest guards also work in dangerous terrain, often outgunned, and they are underpaid also severely. In such a context, the use of lethal force is not seen as a sign of cruelty, but rather as a method of survival to safeguard the forest. of both species as well as for themselves. And this success story is actually very, very visible. However, conservation cannot be judged only by numbers. Ethics matter, animals' rights matter, but human rights also matter. Ecological balance also matters. So there's a lot of complexity actually about what should be done. Over the years, there have been reports of alleged excesses, suspected poachers killed without any due process. Local villages were misidentified as criminals. There's a lot of nexus, and mostly I feel that people who get killed on the ground, they are not necessarily they are doing it because they dislike rhino or they are against conservation or anything. They are doing out of absolute poverty or greed. But actually, the people who are controlling them, because it took me quite a bit of time to understand that conservation is actually not about animals. It's about the system. It's about power. It's about what drives something, right? And I was trying to do some research to understand whether we are doing actually anything to stop these people in power, these rackets, and to eradicate the problem from its root, or are we just targeting the individuals who are also getting exploited by people in power? So, apart from legal answers, there's always a philosophical and ethical layer to it, one that echoes concerns long held in conservation discourse. What does it mean when protecting nature becomes a battleground? At what point does violence against environments and the people who protect them reflect broader tensions in society? We cannot completely throw Camus out. In parts of India, including Assam, forest protection has often intervened with the complex human issues. Livelihoods depended on access to land, enforcement measures that alienate local communities, and clashes over rights and usage. These are tough problems with no single answer. And when something as symbolic as a growing forest is destroyed, it forces a larger reckoning. The burning of Molai Kothani 2.0 is painful because it was avoidable. It was an attack not just on trees and animals, but on a vision of coexistence between people and animals. The emotional response, outrage, grief, disbelief, be it from Aravalli to Assam, whatever is happening in India, it's all natural. But instead of a knee-jerk reaction, it also calls for a deeper reflection about how society reconciles with conservation ideals with societal values. Can we unwaveringly hold to the belief that forests are sacred, they are worth protecting at all costs to biodiversity and communal well-being? Yes, but that protection must be rooted in inclusive engagement, not abstraction, involving villages, authorities, educators, policymakers in shared stewardship. But the problem in India is that corruption is rampant.
ये हड्डी तोड़ दिया यहाँ वाला।
इसका मेडिसिन चल रहा है अभी?
कोई पैसा नहीं मिला, मैं कई बार रिपोर्ट भी लगाने गया और सरकार ने कोई पैसा नहीं मिला जंगल की तरफ से।
Also, I wonder that if tomorrow some of the influential businessmen with pro-government agenda wants to do mining in Kaziranga, somehow wants to accrue some benefits from rhino horn, will the same intent be carried? The Aravalli crisis, for example, it reflects the steady destruction of a vital ecological zone through mining, real estate expansion, and regulatory rollbacks, despite clear environmental risk. During protests and legal challenges, allegations emerged that certain social media influencers actually took payments to make real to defend governments, discredit environmental activists, and create a perception of public support online, raising serious concerns about transparency, ethics, and the manipulation of public discourse. So, conservation in India is a very complicated topic. As a matter of fact, anywhere in the world, just because you hear that pandas are no longer endangered, there's no, unless we deep dive into exactly what has happened, we will never know what is actually happening with the animal. And exactly this is what Albert Camus feared, albeit in a completely different context. But when conservation results in militarization of a forest, when forest itself becomes battlefield, the idea that it cannot be stopped reflects not strength. It rather exposes vulnerability, a sheer failure, the failure to imagine conservation without violence. And this raises a troubling question. Shall we continue to tackle the rhino conservation project like the way we were doing because we are seeing enormous success? Or it's the time to actually rethink our strategy and probably try to target those who are sitting on their high horses somewhere and using poor people like pawn. When you will see actually my next Kaziranga Chronicle video, so much complexities obviously will not come to the surface because I have added my safari experience. It is essentially a personalized storytelling kind of narrative. And it may come across in certain parts that as if I'm glorifying the violence, as if because in order to make the effect of the documentary, especially for those who don't know it, with background music and all that, it's in some places it may come across that I am actually glorifying and stylizing the violence to create a cinematic effect, but it doesn't mean that I condone that kind of violence. Of course, at the same time, the huge awareness and the constant monitoring to safeguard rhino are things to actually be really appreciative for.